I'm Ali Abunameh here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. And 1 year ago this week, the Al-Aqsa flood operation began. Palestinian resistance fighters broke out of one of the most heavily guarded places on earth, the occupied Gaza Strip, and totally routed the Israeli army within a few hours. That's the reality of what we saw and of what happened on October 7th. But both Israel and its Western backers in government and media have tried to erase from popular memory these images of Israeli military defeat and to replace them with alternative images of Israeli vulnerability and victimhood, in which defenseless Israeli babies were burned and countless Israeli women raped. We knew pretty early on, and we know now conclusively, that those atrocities did not happen. But using Israeli atrocity propaganda as a pretext, the United States and Europe gave their full support to the Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people, which continues 1 year later amid an ever-broadening regional conflict. In fact, on that day, Israel killed many, if not most, of its own people as it invoked the so-called Hannibal Directive, a secretive military doctrine which permits any level of force needed to prevent Israelis being taken captive. Israel has now extended its genocidal violence to Lebanon, and it is also threatening to attack Iran, following Iran's missile retaliation for Israel's repeated Israeli aggressions against Iran. Armed by the United States, Israel has killed more than 41,000 people in Gaza and more than 2,000 in Lebanon, according to official figures, although estimates for what may be the actual numbers in Gaza range significantly higher. What is the historical context for the events of October 7th, 2023, and why does Israel enjoy such total support from Western governments? Where does the role of the Israel lobby fit in, and what might come next? Joining us now to talk about Al-Aqsa flood 1 year later is Joseph Massad. He is professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University and one of the most significant public intellectuals today. We're honored that he's regularly contributed to the electronic Intifada for many years, and he writes a regular column for Middle East Eye, providing essential historical context and perspective on contemporary events. Joseph Massad is the author of Islam and Liberalism, Desiring Arabs, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Colonial Effects, and many, many other articles. He's currently working on a major history of settler colonialism. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you for having me, Ali. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. We're likewise honored. Joseph, let's start with looking back over the last year. Israel, with Western backing, has been perpetrating a genocide against the Palestinian people, which it is now extending to Lebanon. From the very first day, even when Israeli leaders made it abundantly clear that they intended to commit genocide, the United States and the European Union have been its principal arms suppliers, supporters, and accomplices. Meanwhile, the few countries or groups that have attempted direct intervention to stop the genocide in accordance with the Genocide Convention are Hezbollah in Lebanon, Yemen, resistance groups in Iraq, and of course, Iran. Were you surprised either by the scale of the atrocities Israel is willing to commit or by the seemingly limitless Western support? What explains this level of Western government support that has shocked even significant portions of the population in countries including Britain and Germany? What is at stake for these regimes in supporting Israel to this level?
I was certainly surprised and shocked by the scale of the genocide that Israel embarked upon since that day and continues to actually perpetrate today. I was not surprised by its ability to inflict so much violence. This is something it had always done. This is, after all, a country that is based on the principle of ethnic cleansing. It is a country that is based on the principle of having the right to commit atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity with abandon, without any kind of even reprimand, let alone penalty from the international community that is dominated by Western countries, which are its allies. And of course, I was not surprised by the support it received from Western countries. This has been indeed the kind of course of such support and sort of supplying of arms and money since the settler colony was established in 1948. So that was not surprising. But indeed, the scale of the genocide was absolutely horrifying. It's an awesome scale that no one would have predicted before. Yet, of course, anything that we believe Israel is capable of, Israel often surprises us by showing that it is capable of doing so much more harm to civilians and to people, so much more, to cause so much more destruction around it and in the region. So I believe that, in fact, so a big part of the scale of this genocidal war that it had launched is very much enshrined within its very sort of raison d'etre, its very existence ever since it came to exist in 1948. As for the announcement that it is initially and subsequently by Israeli leaders that what they intend to do is to commit genocide, this was not unlike, for example, the Zionist movements often telling us and advertising that its plan for the Palestinian people was to be expelled. This is what the Zionist movement had announced back in the 1890s and continued to make plans for in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And when Palestinians would bring this to the attention of the international community, they would be reassured that indeed all the Zionist movement wants to do is to coexist peacefully with them. So the more recent sort of genocidal declarations by the Israeli leadership, its media, and large sections of its populations and political parties and intellectuals was also announced to the world, yet there had been initially denials that this is in fact what was happening. The ongoing attempt to refer to Israel's genocide and war on the Palestinian people as Israel's war with Hamas, when in fact the declarations by Israel's president and prime minister and other ministers were clearly made as targeting the Palestinian people as a whole, and not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and now in Lebanon, in addition to, of course, targeting the Lebanese people. So that was not surprising. But the scale itself, of course, had been, and this is, of course, based on a number of factors. These include the fact that the Palestinians have deigned to actually resist their colonial master that had subjected them to settler colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide, including the incarceration of more than 2 million Palestinians in Gaza in a concentration camp since 2005. Also, the fact that the Palestinians' military defeat of the Israeli army has in many ways, of course, threatened Israel's image as a military superpower who had been able to quash all resistance to its racist colonial settler project. Now that that image of invulnerability of its military was destroyed, its pride was in many ways injured, but it's not only a matter of psychological pride, but rather its standing as the policeman of the region at the behest of the United States and Western European countries, and the worry that it might not be as dependable for them to carry out its job as it had been previously. Also, of course, the scale of the genocide, which is, again, part and parcel of the racism that is intrinsic to Zionism about ridding itself of the Palestinian people, either through expulsion or murder, is also a lesson that Israel believes it is teaching Palestinians so as never to resist them again and to resist its apartheid regime and its Jewish supremacist regulations and rules. it was also, of course, I mean, the idea that Israel itself was threatened by this attack rather than its grip on the Gaza Strip was engineered to also galvanize and unite an Israeli electorate that had been divided for several years now, with massive demonstrations against the current Israeli government for threatening the rights of a portion of the Jewish electorate in the service of another portion of the Jewish electorate. This also, of course, had led to Western countries taking the side of those so-called secular Israeli Jews who felt threatened by juridical reforms that could threaten the rights of these Jews. Of course, as we know, there's a consensus in Israel among all the electorate, whether religious, right-wing, fascistic, liberal, or left-wing, on how Israel must treat the Palestinian people. But there is no such consensus on what rights Jews should have, especially whether religious or secular. So that kind of division has led to denunciations of Israeli government policies and juridical reforms by the US government and West European countries prior to the genocide, prior to the Palestinian resistance operation. So in again portraying Israel as an existential crisis, which actually it has become since then, it wanted to make sure that any doubts about supporting the current Netanyahu government by Israel's allies would be mitigated. And now they would go back to business as usual. So in this sense, we see that the scale of the atrocities in many ways has sort of been achieved several of its purposes. It continues to, of course, the long held dream of a Palestine empty of its Palestinian population, which was not fully fulfilled. Remember, several even Israeli intellectuals who had including the historian Benny Morris, who had written extensively on the expulsion of the Palestinians by Zionist forces in 1948, had in the last 25 years expressed regret that the Israelis were unable to cleanse all of Palestine of Palestinians. He, of course, represents a large number of people who believe this, especially as we've seen polls that have insisted that Palestinian citizens of Israel should be expelled or should not remain in the country, let alone those in the West Bank and Gaza whom Israel had purposely expelled since 1967 and continues to make their lives unlivable in the hope that they would leave. Short of that, it would kill them en masse, as it has been doing in Gaza. Yes, I was surprised and shocked by Israel's ongoing genocide and the scale of it, but not of the Western support it has received.
Well, I want you to just say a little bit more about that, because I think if I think about my own reaction, I was not surprised by what Israel is capable of. But I think I must have naively believed that there was a limit to what the West would tolerate. It turns out there is no limit to what they will tolerate. And, you know, we can talk about Israel as a policeman, a dependable asset for them in the region, but ultimately, doesn't it become, if we think about it in the sociopathic terms they do, doesn't it become at a certain point too expensive to maintain this level of unquestioning support? What is it behind that? Is it purely a matter of interest? Is it cultural? Is it ancient religious and ethnic hatreds that the West harbors towards the people of the region? What explains this level of Western barbarism and savagery towards the people of Palestine in the region?
I mean, all of the above and more. I'm not sure why the West would not tolerate this scale of devastation and genocide when it itself has committed and continues to present itself as able to commit and willing to commit such atrocities itself. After all, the American murderous invasion of Iraq, which sacrificed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis without any apologies just a couple of decades ago, remains with us, and the Americans continue not to apologize, but rather to be proud of their achievement in Iraq, at least in terms of the actual invasion and what they felt they had achieved. The French, as of now, have never actually apologized for the genocide they committed in Algeria when they killed upwards of 1 million people and colonized the country for over 132 years. I'm not sure why they would not tolerate Israel committing a genocide today in the name of the very same Western values that they themselves continue to uphold. The British have done similar things across Africa and elsewhere in India. So I'm not sure the West is a stranger to these kinds of genocidal wars, of which it itself, of course, is guilty. Remember, the United States back at the end of World War II and until this very day continues to defend its atomic genocide in Japan when it bombed deliberately civilian populations in Nagasaki and Hiroshima and killed upwards of 215,000 people. And it defended that then and continues to defend that today with the lie that in murdering 200,000 people in cold blood by experimenting on them with atomic weapons, it saved 500,000, or more recently, I've read an account of upwards to 30 million possible American casualties. So the idea of committing genocide to prevent an imaginary genocide is well established in Western sort of justifications for their barbarisms. This is, after all, genocide is indeed a Western liberal value. I mean, it should always be considered as such. And I always am perplexed when people question Israel's commitment to Western liberal values because they think Western liberal values are actually the propagandistic values that Western imperialist governments put out there. I believe Israel is sincere when it says it indeed abides by Western liberal values, one of which is genocide, one of which is settler colonialism, one of which is utter racism and racial contempt for its racial inferiors. All of that is part of Western values, and Israel, I believe, is correct and sincere in claiming that it upholds them and protects them in its war.
Professor Massad, I just wanted to follow a thread that you mentioned a few minutes ago in terms of Israel's and the West's existential crisis. How can we understand this expanding genocide in the region? Is this another round of violence that will end in another uneasy truce, or do you think that we're in this more decisive existential phase? Is this the opening round of the Palestinian war of liberation from Zionist colonialism and regional liberation from U.S. imperialism? How do you see this?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think this is an existential war for the Palestinians as well. People don't speak about that. They often speak about it being an existential war for the Israelis. For the Palestinian people, especially in the last 3 decades or so, their lives have been upended by the complete co-optation of their former representative, meaning the PLO, for which they had fought on several fronts to establish in the 1960s and in the 1970s, and which had sort of ultimately been reduced to a collaborationist authority, not unlike the South Vietnamese state, not unlike Gaza Strip in South Africa, with the enemies of the Palestinian people. So for the last 30 years, what we have seen is an intensification of the oppression of the Palestinian people, an intensification of the colonization of Palestinian lands. We went sort of up to almost 1 million colonists in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Remember, often people speak of the increase in the settler population in the West Bank minus East Jerusalem. but East Jerusalem, first of all, which now, or Jerusalem itself, which seems to have taken over almost a third of the territories of the West Bank. If you add, and you must add, the number of settlers in what is called Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank, you have over 1 million settlers that have come to colonize the land of the Palestinians since 1967 alone. So ultimately what has been happening is a kind of the Israeli strategy has always been to have sort of tactical goals, and the strategy is to have tactical goals. And the tactic is always to keep postponing any so-called resolution, as if this is a problem and not a colonial situation, a resolution to the Palestinian problem, as they would call it in international parlance. And as a result, what we've had, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear the ambulance and the fire trucks passing by. This is New York City, after all. But I think this amount of neglect of the Palestinian struggle, it's an attempt to fully erase that struggle and render the status quo in a way a permanent status quo, as in the situation in Gaza will continue until it cannot continue. Then we'll have another solution which will restore it or perpetuate the oppression of the Palestinians under a new arrangement. Similarly in the West Bank, similarly in Israel. We've seen several changes, of course, over the last years. The increase in the number of racist laws targeting Palestinian citizens of Israel, especially since 2018, but even before, since 2000. I'm speaking, of course, of the nation-state law, which was the most recent of such laws, a basic law in Israel, but also the refusal to even continue with the charade that the Americans called in the early 1970s as the peace process, which is, of course, an American euphemism for the continuation of Israeli colonization and the subjugation of the Palestinian people and the Arab countries to Israel's plans. So in that sense, if the Palestinians, especially those in Gaza who are have been the most oppressed amongst the Palestinian population. We're not even speaking about the refugees outside and the diaspora, but those within Gaza who have been under the most sadistic type of oppression by the Israelis understood very well that their lives were no longer livable, and that the only way out is indeed to resist and to try to overthrow this racist apartheid Jewish supremacist regime. So as a result, for the Palestinian people, indeed, this is an existential war. They realize very well that unless they actually force the Israelis and its international backers to back down on its ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people, that oppression will continue at will. So that's on the Palestinian side. For the Israelis, of course, the Israelis have always portrayed every situation they find themselves in as an existential one. And perhaps they're not wrong, because they understand that if the basis of the very establishment of Israel is ethnic cleansing, is Jewish supremacy, is apartheid, and a predatory military power that wants to take over the region, then any form of resistance to Israel and any of these Israeli practices is seen correctly as an existential war. That basically what these people are fighting are is the very essence on which the Israeli state has been founded. So in that sense, they are right. But of course, they use this in a different way. After all, even though Zionism began as a movement to colonize Palestine half a century before the rise of the Nazis and before the Holocaust, after 1948, it was born of the genocide insofar as people who supported it began to justify their support for Israel as a form of reparation for the genocide. It's true, it was not Europe that paid for the reparations, it was the Palestinians, but that Europe granted the Zionists the right to oppress the Palestinians and exact from them the reparation that the Europeans owed the surviving Jewish people after the horrific genocide of the Nazis and the refusal of other European countries and the US to take in Jewish surviving refugees after the war. So, but since that moment, of course, since Israel made genocide, at least ideologically, the very justification for its existence, and began to propagate that ideology, and became more successful actually only in the 1960s, especially among Jewish communities in the European states or in the US, who began to support Israel precisely because Israel basically advanced two types of arguments. One, that the existence of Israel is the only guarantee to prevent another genocide that targets Jews. And on the other hand, that Israel itself is subject to the possibility of another genocide by its very Palestinian victims and Arab neighboring victims if it did not get the support of these Jewish communities and the Western countries. So it's a very interesting kind of logic that you see there. Now, as a result of that, you begin to see in 1967, the propaganda was that Israel was indeed in an existential crisis, that allegedly the three Arab countries which it invaded are alleged to have been planning an invasion that would finish Israel, and therefore its invasion and occupation of Arab countries in 1967 was in defense to prevent another genocide of Jews, according to this propaganda. Similarly, in 1973, we see similar propaganda that Syria's and Egypt's attempt to invade their own occupied territories and retrieve them from Israel, which it occupied in 1967, was also allegedly a genocidal war against Israel. As we know, at the time, Golda Meir prepared the 13 nuclear bombs or atomic bombs that Israel had at the time to be dropped on Damascus and Cairo, and the intervention of Henry Kissinger and the Americans by providing the Israelis with necessary armaments and ammunition prevented that from happening and reversed the advancing Syrian and Egyptian armies at the time, and reversed the outcome of the war. So it is constant, this idea that Israel's existence is always at stake, and that Israel needs to do everything that it must do, because any threat to it, in fact, is a genocidal threat. So we see this again today, that Israel realizes that what happened last year is in many ways threatens its military superiority. What has happened since has proven that indeed it no longer has military superiority. It no longer has the power of deterrence, of military deterrence, which it had previously, or it thought it had previously, as a result of Iranian or Hezbollah or Hamas resistance attacks against the Jewish supremacist regime. So as a result of that, its argument has been that the extent to which it declares that it wants to commit suicide against the Palestinian people, it insists that it is necessary to commit this genocide to prevent a possible imaginary genocide against the Jewish people, that it convinces its clients are on some kind of mission to kill Jews. So in that sense, this existential aspect of Israel, now has become actually true in a sense, that the entire world now realizes that this is a genocidal country. It is an ethnic cleansing country. It's a central colonial country that would do anything that it needs to do to preserve the right to continue in these policies. The Western countries will continue to support it because, first of all, it is an important imperial station for them. It has been established by them for that purpose. We know this, for example, from the late 19th century. Ever since the Suez Canal was built, the idea was put forth by initially Protestant Zionists, but subsequently by Jewish Zionists, that establishing an imperial station near the Suez Canal would be necessary to protect the canal in the future from any attempt by the locals to take it over. This is indeed what happened in 1956. At the time, Israel's sponsors were the British and the French. They indeed colluded with Israel to start a war against Egypt so that they could invade and under the pretext of protecting their interests in the Suez Canal. In 1967, Israel was able in many ways to finish off President Nasser of Egypt and his regime, something that the US had tried to do unsuccessfully since the mid-1950s. Israel was successful in defeating the Egyptian army and ultimately in neutralizing Nasser, who survived for 2 more years, but really as a defeated man. So in many ways, Israel has provided these services. In 1978 and in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to destroy the PLO. The PLO was something that that was threatening to Arab regimes, to Israel itself, and to U.S. interests. So in that sense, while it also threatened Israel, the Israelis would not have invaded without a U.S. green light, if not a U.S. plan to begin with. Similarly in 82, and on and on. All I'm trying to say is that indeed Israel has fulfilled the mandate and the charge that it was given by the colonial countries, especially since 67 by the Americans, who have taken over more effectively from the British and the French. And therefore, it continues to be necessary for them, perhaps not in an existential way. It's existential for Israel to remain standing as the state that it is. For European countries, it may be in some ways existential. In others, the costs, as Ali was alluding to earlier, might rise to such a level that they would no longer support it. But I think that would only happen if Israel were no longer able to fulfill its mission, to fulfill the services that it has fulfilled for the West. Only then would the price of supporting it become too high for the Europeans and the Americans.
It's interesting hearing you talk about Israel constantly having to present itself as a victim of genocide or a potential victim of genocide. And we saw that propaganda again after October 7th, this talking point put out by the Israeli government and its supporters that October 7th was the biggest mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust. If that's true, it was probably the biggest mass killing of Jews by the Israeli government, since we know, we'll talk about that perhaps later in the program, the Hannibal Directive. But I want to talk about this constant refrain of Israeli propaganda over the last year, that the operation itself on October 7th was motivated by hatred of Jews. And you see that typified in this tweet from Ursula von der Leyen, the also known as Frau Genocide. She was named that by the former Irish member of Parliament, Irish member of the European Parliament, gave her that nickname. But Ursula von der Leyen says that on 7 October, Hamas killed or abducted people for one reason, because they were Jews. And this has been and remains predominant in official Western narratives. And we've seen it manifested in the actions of university administrations in the United States and government authorities in Germany, for example, punishing or prohibiting the slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" by claiming that it's anti-Semitic. We'll talk about repression on university campuses in a few minutes, but talk to us now about the history of Israel's claim that opposition to Zionism's colonial project is anti-Semitic. How far back does this phenomenon go? Has it been an effective shield for Israel? And do you think it still works as a method to intimidate people into silence about Israel's crimes?
Well, I think the rationale for that kind of a propagandistic claim is precisely to hide that in Israel, Jews are colonists, to hide Israeli colonization. And therefore, every time Israel is faced with the accusation of being a colonial country, a settler colonial country, and that its population are colonists who are imported from other countries to replace an indigenous population, the response is, no, 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 they hate us because we're Jews, in the sense that presumably what that means is that had non-Jews colonized Palestine and took over their country, expelled them, or committed genocide against them, the Palestinians would have been happy with them and not resisted them, and that the only reason why they resist them is because they are Jewish. It's an absurd idea, but it goes back to the beginning of Zionist colonialism. We begin to see actually such sentiments expressed by Zionist settlers even in the 1890s, who once they arrived from Russia especially from Odessa and what is today Ukraine, into Palestine as settlers. And of course, as we know from Zionist records, the Palestinian peasants resisted every single Jewish colony that was built on Palestinian land, sometimes purchased by moneylenders, but which evicted Palestinian peasants on which these peasants had worked previously. Every time these Palestinian peasants resisted, there was this sense of, oh, you know, we've just escaped the anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish Russian pogromists, and here we are now facing a Palestinian resistance. What this means is that in the mind of the Zionists, that their presence as Jews in Russia or in Germany or elsewhere and in Palestine is the same, that the status of their presence in Palestine is just the status of being Jewish and not of being colonists. When in fact, of course, in Europe, Jews who were attacked by pogromists or by anti-Semites were indeed being attacked for being Jewish. They were part of these countries, they were citizens of these countries or subjects of these countries, depending on the kind of regime that ruled, whereas in Palestine, they were not indigenous, save for a few thousand native Jews that lived in Palestine prior to Zionist settlement. But besides that, the majority, the vast majority of the Jewish population of Israel, like 99.9%, are in fact not indigenous. And what is being questioned in Palestine, or what is being resisted by the native Palestinians, has always been their colonial status, their colonizing efforts, their theft of Palestinian land, their eviction of Palestinian peasants off their land, etc. We see this repeated even in the 1920s with the beginning of Palestinian revolts against Jewish colonists. Those were being identified by the Zionist leadership at the time as anti-Semitic attacks, as if, again, that the Palestinians were attacking Jews for being Jewish and not for being colonists. This takes us to the 30s and 40s, even when Palestinians began to radically oppose ongoing Israeli, or rather Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine. The Israelis, or the Zionists at the time, insisted that that was motivated not by a nationalist sentiment to preserve their country against settler colonialism, but rather for being anti-Jewish. So it is very clear that from the start, the idea is anti-Semitism is used precisely as an ideological cover for Zionism and Jewish settler colonialism in Palestine, and to prevent Palestinians from ever achieving legitimacy in resisting Jewish colonialism, which must always be framed as a settler, as anti-Semitism. So, of course, what is ironic in all of this is that it is Israel that justifies its existence by saying, we exist to serve Jews. We exist because it is the right of Jews to take over this land. It is Israel that identifies its achievements as well as its wars and its atrocities in the name of the Jewish people. It claims that it has to commit all the atrocities and war crimes that it commits in the name of defending the Jewish people. So it is Israel that identifies itself, its crimes, as Jewish. The Palestinian opponents and anti-Zionists, including, of course, the vast majority of anti-Zionist Jews, understand this very well, which is why we always identify Israeli crimes as Israeli crimes, the crimes of the Israeli government, of the Israeli army, and not of the Jewish people. It is Israel's anti-Semitic claim that it commits these crimes in the name of Jews that has to be challenged. But of course, it isn't. This is the claim that is taken in and on by the Western governments that support it, for the very same reasons that they understand that in the age of the end of colonialism after World War II, the only way to defend Israel's ongoing colonial efforts is by claiming that anyone who resists them is resisting the rights of Jews rather than the right of colonists. So this continues. This is, I think, a very, very strong propaganda that has been quite persuasive to many. it began to weaken after 1982. This is the first time after Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which killed close to 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians, that Israel was accused of committing genocide, both by the General Assembly that passed a major resolution at the time without any opposition, and by several countries, including the Soviet Union, a number of European and Latin American countries, after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, who all accused Israel of committing genocide in Lebanon, that its goal was to destroy the Palestinians as a nation. We see then that conviction by many of Israel's supporters in the West, both Jewish and Gentile, to have been shaken in ways that it had not before, and beginning to realize that this country that justifies its existence by virtue of appealing to the Holocaust of World War II, that because Jews were victims of the Holocaust and of genocide, it has the right to colonize the Palestinian people. Now suddenly it itself begins to be accused of committing genocide in the 1980s and 90s, up until sort of the last year, where it now is being accused of committing genocide by also the International Court of Justice and a large number of countries around the world, and a genocide that is being documented, and being live streamed around the world, despite the attempt to cover it up by the mainstream Western media in the US or in Western Europe. This has created an ironical situation, if you will, that suddenly, you cannot, this is the appeal to genocide as a justification for Israel's genocide is not working well. It's a sword that cuts both ways. You cannot ask us to support you because you claim to represent a people who have indeed been victims of a horrific genocide during World War II, and at the same time ask us to support you to commit a genocide at the same time. So this point has not sold well, even though Israel keeps saying we need to commit this genocide to prevent a possible imaginary genocide that we are claiming we are preventing. It's not selling well. It certainly is not selling well with a large number of Jews in Europe and the United States, and of Gentiles as well. But this is why so many Jews have come to be in the forefront of the movement against Israeli apartheid, Jewish supremacy, and genocide, and trying to pressure Western governments and corporations to stop arming Israel and to stop investing in it. So that logic, I think, no longer works as effectively, except in the corridors of power. I mean, like I said earlier, the US continues to defend its own genocide in Japan, or even against Native Americans. The French continue to do so also in relation to France. The Germans only lately apologized very kind of lightly for their genocide in Namibia, but not in Tanganyika, where they killed upwards of 300,000 Africans at the beginning of the 20th century. So some genocides deserve some apologies, others don't. But ultimately, these countries understand this Israeli logic, which is an extension of them. Israel is not reinventing the wheel in claiming that it must commit a genocide to prevent an imaginary one. This is an argument they've all used before, and quite successfully, and they continue to use them in a number of cases.
I just want to clarify that it was Claire Daly, the former member of the European Parliament, who gave Ursula von der Leyen the nickname Frau Genocide, which seems to have stuck. Her name had slipped my mind. And Joseph, while you're talking, I'm thinking, I saw recently something about how in Germany there's now this trend, this new intellectual trend to describe the German people as victims of Nazism. So the Jews were the victims of the Nazis, but the German people were also the victims of the Nazis. So it's in a way an intellectual withdrawal of the apology for Nazism, to say, it wasn't us, it was the Nazis. It wasn't the Nazis, of course, must have come from Mars or Venus or Jupiter, I don't know where. Have you heard anything about? I don't want to take us too far off course, but
I have not, but I'll just say briefly that, of course, what has been covered up, of course, ever since the Holocaust and the Nazi regime's sort of demise is that the Nazi regime, of course, also targeted German communists, right? And of course, and German communists also included Jews, but that indeed that the only people who were not perhaps responsible for the Nazis in Germany, besides German Jews, would be German communists. But the rest of the Germans were, if not actively engaged in supporting the Nazi party, as members of it, they stood by and perhaps supported it from sort of on the side. But of course, I mean, we understand that the Germans are as much victims of Nazi ideology as white supremacists may be victims of white supremacy as an ideology. But certainly they are not innocent of the Nazi regime that ruled with their support and which they abetted and ultimately sort of helped destroy Europe, right? It was a regime that killed upwards of 54 million Europeans because of course, its settler colonial plans to take over all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe and settle it with Germans. And while engaging in that horrific war, it decided to kill 13 million people in the concentration camps, 6 million of whom at least were Jewish.
Professor Massad, I wanted to talk a little bit about how students and educators are still engaging and expanding their protests across American university campuses against the genocide in Gaza, and specifically against the complicity of these institutions in that genocide through their, their multiple links with Israel, whether it's investment or research or institutional partnership. These protests and these encampments spread around the world. Last spring, your own university, Columbia, was at the heart of this movement. It was also in the forefront of violent repression of its own students, with the now former Columbia president, Minu Shafiq, infamously calling in the New York Police Department to brutalize and arrest students. We saw similar university-sponsored violence against students and educators copied across the country. It started back up again. And as a new academic year has just begun, many universities are putting in place new restrictions on free speech in order to prevent and punish protests against the ongoing genocide, including labeling Zionism as a political ideology as some sort of like protected identity trait. How do you explain this level of violence and repression at these, liberal institutions that purport to be bastions of free speech and academic thought? What role do these institutions actually play, and how are you seeing students and educators resist this kind of repression?
First of all, I think, of course, the attack on the universities begins early. This is in the 1970s and early 80s, you begin to see an attempt at transforming the curricula of elite universities, especially in the United States, as a result of the civil rights movement, etc. In Europe as well, after the decolonization, you begin to see an attempt to transform some of these curricula, which were, of course, always white supremacist, racist, sexist in every possible way, denying, for example, what had happened and continued to happen to and continues to happen today to Native Americans or to African Americans, etc. So the attempt to transform these curricula in the 70s and 80s generated already during that time, but certainly by the late 1980s, a huge backlash by the white supremacist right wing, beginning to question the very issue of for example, the denigration of some of the classic books of Western civilization, calls for no longer teaching the books written by dead white men and things of that sort, versus, for example, others. I mean, Edward Said was one of those who insisted that these books should be taught, but very critically, right? So they should not be erased from history or from curricula, but actually, so we should learn to speak about John Stuart Mill, but also to learn about how he supported colonial oppression and savagery against colonized people, that he supported apartheid in colonized countries, and there should be a different law for white colonists versus non-whites. Similarly, someone like de Tocqueville, who'd written about the so-called democracy in America in the 19th century during slavery and settler colonialism and the oppression of Native Americans, and he himself also not only had liberal ideas about democracy, but also supported the massive killings of Algerians by the French colonial forces. So the point being that there were several wars being the so-called culture wars of the 1990s that began to be huge between different forces. But the rise of the right wing, I think, after Reagan and the backlash against the civil rights movement, which began early in politics in the 70s, but I think on universities in the 80s and 90s, was given a huge sort of push after the events of 9/11. So you begin to see that the attempt to destroy the university from within. I mean, the American university is a liberal institution that has been committed to a liberal form of knowledge, liberal arts, and in the tradition of 19th century German and some British universities. And that was being chipped away at by these attacks. Given the fact that it was more difficult after 9/11 to begin to attack only curricula that deals with American ethnic minorities or the rise of the women's movement or sexual rights movement, I think these forces felt, and correctly so, that perhaps a safer entry into introducing repressive measures in these curricula would be the Israel and Palestinian issue. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, you begin to see a major schism between media knowledge of the Middle East and the production of new academic knowledge of the Middle East, especially in relation to Palestine and Israel. This coincided with the production of a large number of new histories written by Israeli historians, the so-called new historians, based on recently declassified Israeli archives, which also questioned the story that Israel had officially told and which the West had echoed and repeated over the previous 3 decades or so. These attempts, this new scholarship in the Western Academy, even in the Israeli Academy, began to be mainstream. So in mainstream US Middle East studies or European Middle East studies today, nobody questions that, of course, Israel is a settler-colonial state, or that Zionism was a settler-colonial movement, or that Israel and the Zionists expelled 90% of the Palestinian people, almost 1 million people, between November 30th, 1947 and December 1948. Nobody questions that Israel is a Jewish supremacist racist state with a battery of some 65 laws or more that discriminate between its Jewish citizens and non-Jewish citizens and keep non-citizens, Palestinian non-citizens, under even more, again, awesome and amazing system of apartheid and a pogromist system under this kind of attack. So all of that, in fact, is mainstream. I mean, you would not be really a respected historian in the Middle East of the region or a political scientist of the region if you question these well-established facts, and they're well-established from Israeli archives, right? Official archives, I mean, military and government and what have you. So nonetheless, the attack by pro-Israel forces and by right-wing forces began there because, of course, in the US, both liberals and conservatives support Israel. Both liberals and conservatives are committed to Israel's right to be a Jewish supremacist state. Therefore, the idea was that you would not encounter a lot of resistance on university campuses if that was the entry point, and then you can expand to other points. We saw some major resistance even then in the 2000s by even the then provost of Columbia University, Jonathan Cole, who wrote an amazing book called The Great American University about the history of education, and at other Ivy League schools. However, increasingly, of course, by 2004, 2005, you begin to see these attacks multiply in a huge way. At the time, we had a president at Columbia University, Bollinger, who portrayed himself and was portrayed as a defender of civil rights, being one of the biggest supporters of Israel, the biggest crusader on it, against pro-Palestinian voices on campus at that time. I was targeted by pro-Israel forces off campus, and he allowed them entry into this campus. But of course, this was happening in different campuses. We begin, and of course, that there was a momentum for that lobbying attempt that slowly began to accumulate power inside universities, saying, and again, equating any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. The difficulty was that a large number of Jewish scholars are either critical of Zionism and Israel or anti-Zionist in Israel. They had a bit of a hard time with this. We already begin to see Israel trying to delegitimize such scholars back in the early 1970s. In 1972, Israel's foreign minister, the South African-born Aubrey Solomon, known as Abba Eban, at the time convened a conference in Israel of American Jewish organizations, where he announced that there had been a rise in the United States of leftist anti-Semitism by the New Left and the Civil Rights Movement, and that, amazingly, it included some Jewish personalities. At the time, there were two major Jewish intellectuals that were critical of Israel, Noam Chomsky and I.F. Stone. They were denigrated as not Jews who uphold Jewish traditions, what would come later to be known as self-hating Jews. By the time you get to after 9/11 and the 2000s and today, there's a large number of Jewish intellectuals and academics who are who speak sort of forthrightly and openly and in public spaces, publicly, against Israel or criticize Israel, and understand that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. On the contrary, and they understand Israel's claim that to attack Israeli crimes is anti-Semitism is itself an anti-Semitic claim, because it wants to say that its crimes are Jewish crimes and not the crimes of the Israeli government, and that if you attack it as such, what you're doing is actually attacking Jews rather than Israel itself. So this created a problem. Clearly, that was overcome in the last year we saw on my campus how two organizations in which Jewish students were prominent, whether the Jewish Voice for Peace, or the pro-Palestinian group of fighting against apartheid, which also included many Jews. I'm speaking here of SJP, of course, and which was not only Palestinians, but rather many pro-Palestinian students from all ethnicities and backgrounds, including a large number of Jewish students. Both these groups were, of course, penalized for speaking out against the genocide, heavily so. And of course, it was seen as ironic that this was carried out by an Egyptian American professor. It is interesting, many in the Arabic press did refer to her as a kind of Uncle Tom, that she was someone who was seemed to have no sense of who she was identity-wise, and often spoke only in language that was used by the State Department, and not as an intellectual, not as someone who was leading one of the most important and prestigious American universities as such. Nonetheless, of course, and after she has rendered all the services that were required of her, she realized that she would not be of much use subsequently, and resigned on her own. But I don't think it's, I mean, Bollinger had done this before her, and he was a white Christian man. And I'm sure other university professors who have no relationship to the Arab world, or no ethnic relationship to the Arab world or to Israel or to Jewish communities would have taken similar steps. But it is ironic in her case, of course. It is important to stress that, for example, when Jonathan Cole, who's Jewish American, fought against this repression of pro-Palestinian views, he was taking a principled position in defense of the university, of academic freedom, and of freedom of expression, something which she did not, right, or Bollinger did not. At any rate, so what you see today, I mean, the increase in that kind of repression is the result of the accumulation of that kind of influence that begins in the 1980s, accelerates in the 2000s, and reached this sort of epitome of repression today, because these views have been legitimized, especially by bureaucrats. The fact that universities have become privatized, I mean, even a private university have become no more neoliberalized in many ways, and dependent on donors who now openly threaten them, as they have in the last year, of cutting out fundings. You have a conservative Congress that also is in many ways trying to penalize universities unless they toe the line. You would think this is for liberals, for people who are committed to constitutional rights in the United States, for universities as strong and as powerful as Columbia University. You would think these universities would stand up to them and would say, absolutely not. We will not, in any way move an inch away from our commitment to academic freedom and to freedom of speech, and we will not be blackmailed either by private interests or by Congress to do so. The opposite has happened. So the reliance on private monies, the reliance on Congress in the way that universities have come to rely in, and the profit motive through neoliberalization, which transformed education from a public service into a kind of a corporate profit-making machine, also have played a very important role, I believe.
There is so much there, and I hope that, I think it's something students are realizing, that the university has absolutely no respect for them, and so their resistance is I think one of the most important sites of resistance in the West, in the heart of the empire, and we saw how it echoed around the world. But I want to go to a different area now, Joseph, while we still have you, and sort of pan out and look at the role Israel plays in global politics today. You've written, quote, "The world today is divided between two opposing camps, a minority of powerful imperialist white supremacists, conservatives and liberals alike, including token non-white liberals who support the genocide of the Palestinians, and the majority of the people of the world who do not," end quote. But if this is true, how will it translate into changes on the ground? There is much talk now about a new multipolar world, with China and Russia being the principal rising powers, challenging the military, economic, and cultural hegemony of the United States. How does Israel act as a sort of a cultural marker and touchstone in this emerging world? And can Israel hope to find new imperial sponsors if US decline proceeds to a point where it is no longer willing or able to guarantee the continued existence of the Zionist settler colony in Palestine?
Before I answer that, I just want to add a footnote to my previous answer. As an one of the important things that has happened, I began to speak about this when I answered the question, is this discrepancy between media knowledge and academic knowledge. So when the media covers universities or our curricula or our classes or what we teach, they are shocked to find out that, for example, Israel is accused of ethnic cleansing, because that's something that is not accepted in the New York Times or in the mainstream press. So they think that this is actually something that we made up. This huge gap in the last almost half a century between scholarship and the media accounts for some of this, because you also get sometimes some young impressionable students who've grown up understanding sort of the media situation on this. They come to the university and they think, oh my God, what is this? We've never heard of this before. So the immense media campaign against the universities is very much part of this a huge gap between the ignorance of the media, not only ignorance of the histories of the Middle East, but also of developments within the academy and of academic knowledge on this question. So that is one thing that I wanted to stress. Going to your question about Israel's global positioning, if you will, or at least the fact that the world is being run by a small number of imperialist countries. This has been the case, of course, since World War II. The Soviet Union was an important check on the United States and its Western allies until it sort of floundered by 1990. And since then, the US has had, the run of the world and is able to do what it pleases with few, if any, constraints that sometimes may be placed on it. There has been a rise of some rivals or let's say not even rivals, but people who defy its will. And in that sense, it cannot count on their complete obedience. These include especially, Russia under Putin, and of course China, who really has not in any way challenged the US on any political issue, but has been economically sort of seen and present, and is indeed objectively has become an economic competitor or rival to the United States. In addition to those, you have resistance movements. Prominent among them are those in the Middle East and some regimes who support them, like the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance and the Iranian regime that support them. Some other small resistance groups in different parts of the world that have been mostly quashed or contained. So it's been important for the US to in many ways attempt to quash such resistance or rivalry. And this is why it has militarized three situations in those three areas of the world. Ukraine, as we know well, was weaponized against Russia to bring Russia to heel. That has backfired over the last year and a half or more. Taiwan has been also militarized for so many years, but increasingly so. We see the US military or Navy fleet sort of shuttling between the Taiwan shores and the Middle East to allegedly protect Israel or Taiwan from possible attacks by their enemies. So the three areas are sort of covered in that sense as possible points of ignition or instigation that the US itself has sort of lit the fuse of, if you will. In the case of Russia and China, as we know, they both have had good relations with Israel since the early 1990s. China opened relations with Israel in 1992. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a new and strong friendship that arose. And as we know, despite Russian military help for the Syrian regime, the Russians have not intervened in any way to put a stop to Israel's ongoing, almost daily aggression against Syria through with missile attacks, with Air Force attacks, killing civilians and destroying infrastructure across Syria. So what happens in a world where a minority of the world continues to rule against the will of the majority of the world is what we're seeing now, is that there are attempts by the majority of the world to use legal instruments to fight back against the diktat of the United States and its Western European allies, whether by the use of the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Security Council, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, amongst others, to stop or curb U.S. enthusiasm for these wars and for this genocide unsuccessfully. And I think this is why, I mean, the distinction, and I always say this, a distinction between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the U.S., especially under Trump, is that neither of them has any respect for international law, neither of them has any respect for international institutions or legality. But the Democratic Party wants to pretend that it can use the United Nations as an instrument, as a fig leaf to cover up its ongoing violations of international law and supporting an ongoing genocide, whereas the always much more honest Trump would say, we really have no need for the UN. You know, I mean, we can do whatever we want, and why should we care? And he's right, because the US does what it wants, and why would it care anyway? So what we are seeing is that both parties are bringing the world increasingly closer to a global conflagration. We will see if how intimately connected the US and its Arab regime allies will be in a possible attack on Iran by Syria. As we know, the Iranians have...
By Israel.
By Israel, I'm sorry. The Arab regimes have been spoken to by Iran, if you will, and have been told, and the message was sent clearly, that if any of Iran's petroleum assets are hit inside the country, they will make sure to send their missiles to all the petroleum production areas in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, etc. So what we're seeing is that the commitment of the US and its Western allies to a larger regional war in Israel could bring down the international economy in a way. And I guess for the poor of the world, that might not matter at the end of the day, since the way the international economy is set up today, it is set up to benefit the rich and the imperialist countries and the top echelons of their own societies. But it will wreak havoc on the world. And the Democratic Party seems, you know, the party of war traditionally, until the 1970s, and until the early 80s, when the Republicans joined in and became also a party of war. But the Democratic Party, I think, may go as far as that if it feels that such a war would help its chances in winning against Trump in the next few weeks, would flinch from doing so if they thought that it could weaken them. So would Trump be party to such a war? Possibly. But perhaps, you know, the likelihood is less than if the Democratic Party wins. So they've shown their belligerence. They've shown that they can go the whole 9 yards, as the Americans say, with Israel, and even then some. So you know, Israel is important for them. It is the last stand in Asia for them as a white settler colony. And not only a white settler colony that continues to rule with racist laws. So it's not a white settler colony where the white settlers now have become equal, at least politically and constitutionally. No. So it is very important that it remain, in a way, as an extension of them, upholding their colonial and racial principles since the 19th century, which they've had to somehow soften and mitigate since the 1960s. And you know, they're proving their commitment to it. How much farther they will go in defending Western civilization's commitment to genocide, apartheid, and settler colonialism, it seems to me as far as they need to.
Well, that question about the role of Russia and China is one that's going to keep coming up, and a lot of people have made the observation you have, Joseph, that their role in an immediate sense is rather passive, but then they sort of broaden it out and say, well, these countries are also not shy about supporting Iran and making alliances and military exchanges with Iran and so on, which ultimately end up benefiting the resistance in the region. And so I'm sure that's a topic we're going to come back to.
Remember, if I may say, when the US, of course, nuked Japan at the end of World War II, of course, most analysts would say that this was a threat, this was a signal to the Soviet Union at the time, and the Soviets did not intervene. It was only after 1947, when the Soviets themselves acquired nuclear weapons, that they felt they could actually now stand up to the US, which they tried to do in Korea after 1950. So the silence of Russia and China today is because they understand that they are not a military match to US power, but who knows what the coming years will mean.
Indeed, and we'll certainly continue to discuss that question. In just a few minutes we have left, I don't want to let you go without putting a question to you about the Israel lobby. On its face, it seems incredibly powerful. For example, you alluded to the role of pro-Israel donors in openly blackmailing institutions like Columbia University and many others. And we see in every election cycle, including this one, organizations like AIPAC wielding immense influence, directing millions of dollars against candidates they deem to have transgressed against Israel, even in the mildest way. At the same time, you have argued that the lobby by itself cannot explain US policy in the region. In a recent article for Middle East Eye, you wrote, quote, "The claim that the Israel lobby controls US policy in the Middle East amounts to absolving the US from responsibility for all its imperialist policies in the Arab world and the Middle East at large since World War II." End quote. I'm going to be rather unfair to you by saying, can you give us a fairly quick answer to that? But I'm going to couple that with an invitation to you to come back as soon as you'd like and discuss all these questions with us in much greater detail, because we learn so much from hearing you. But
I apologize for my lengthy answers. I'll try to be brief this time.
No apology needed. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we learn from every single word you're saying, and we would like to have more of you.
Thank you for these kind words. The Israel lobby thesis has always struck me ever since it began to be put forth in the late 70s and early 80s as always unconvincing, because what it wants to say is that the US is not responsible. The lobby is somehow so influential that it can fool US policymakers, it can fool the White House and US corporate interests into believing that they must support Israel, when in fact US interests, corporate or political or strategic or imperialist, do not reside within this formula of supporting Israel. I've always found that so baffling, because as we know, of course, to prove that, you must show us that the United States, for example, has taken a different position on similar struggles elsewhere. The US, as we know, has supported settler colonization everywhere. It was the biggest supporter of apartheid South Africa, of apartheid Rhodesia, of Portuguese settler colonialism in Angola and Mozambique, of South African settler colonialism in Namibia, even of French settler colonialism across of North Africa. This idea that the US does not support settler colonialism has been absurd. I remember confronting a liberal Palestinian in Britain at a public lecture I was giving a few years ago, who was making the point that why do all the Western countries and their liberal media support all the oppressed groups around the world except the Palestinians? I was shocked. And I explained immediately, I have never seen the New York Times defend the rights of the Maoris in New Zealand, or the Aborigines in Australia, or even the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, let alone Native Americans, against settler interests. I don't understand why you would expect the New York Times or the Guardian or anyone else to support the Palestinians more than they would these other oppressed populations. It's not true, utterly untrue. The Palestine exception only works in the cultural realm, in the academic realm, where many people in the public sphere may support Israel, among leftist forces, etc. But it doesn't work when you mention the issue of mainstream media or Western countries who have constantly supported similar countries, similar oppressors as they do Israel. There is no discrepancy there. Also, Israel does not cost them very much. The argument that why should my taxpayers' money go to Israel, you fund, as a taxpayer, as an American taxpayer, you fund a lot more, or you spend a lot more money on all the American bases that exist in the Middle East than on Israel, and with the additional advantage that Israel fights some of these wars at the behest of the US, and it is Israeli soldiers who may be killed in such wars rather than American soldiers. An extra benefit for the US, in fact. So no, I do not believe that Israel is milking the US taxpayer for money in its own interest. Yes, it is taking a huge amount of money from US taxpayers for US imperialist interests, not for Israeli interests. There are many more arguments that I make in my poking holes in the Israel lobby thesis, but I will stop here.
And I'm going to push you a little bit more, and you see that in the current situation now. With Lebanon, with the extension of the war to Lebanon, where it really is the United States pushing Israel to extend its war into Lebanon, just as it did in 2006. Many people will recall that in 2006, it was the Bush administration and Condoleezza Rice who were encouraging Israel to go into Lebanon, and they were disappointed when Israel was not able to destroy Hezbollah and therefore deal a blow to Iran and the axis of resistance, even though that term wasn't used at that time. But at the same time, I mean, they haven't learned anything because Israel is still not able to fulfill that goal. So, I mean, can you comment on that?
This is what's worrisome to Israel. Not only has the U.S. government pushed Israel into wars that Israel welcomes, of course. It's not that Israel is going into these wars reluctantly. It is also in Israel's interests to launch these wars. But what they forget, they often want to say that the Israelis are the ones who tried to convince the Americans or drag the Americans into wars that the Americans have never seen a war that they did not love. So in that sense, since World War II. So the idea that Israel is dragging them, kicking and screaming, is absolutely untrue. And also, I should mention that not only American policymakers, but also huge American corporate donors, Jewish and Gentile alike, are more right-wing on Israel, want to push Israel to be even more right-wing than it is, advise Israel to actually commit, more acts, whether it's territorial expansion or genocidal acts or apartheid rules that Israel has done. We've seen this kind of support that wants to push Israel to do more than it is doing by these American donors. So yes, indeed, this is an American strategy. And I think if Israel decides to attack Iran yet again, as it's been attacking it for decades, this would not be a retaliation. Let us remember that the Israelis have been, in the last decade and a half at least, been attacking Iran regularly. In 2010, they assassinated nuclear scientists in Iran. In 2011, they blew up a missile base, killing several Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and on and on and on. So this would not be really retaliation, because retaliation means that they've been just attacked by Iran for no reason, when Iran was retaliating for so many Israeli attacks on its own country, inside Iran and outside of it. So yes, any attack on Iran would be not only okayed by the Americans, would be called for by the Americans. I do not believe Israel is able to act outside of its borders in any capacity without the Americans leading the way. Within Israel, within the occupied territories, Israel has carte blanche to do what it likes. But outside those borders, the U.S. leads the way.
Well, Joseph, I can see in the comments that people do not want us to end the conversation with you, and I don't want to end it with you. It's you are a professor at Columbia University, but I feel like you've given us a whole semester's worth of education in the last hour or so, and we're very, very grateful for it. And a lot of people are saying that, of course, many of us know you and have read your work for many years, and a lot of people are saying that this is the first time they hear you. So what I want to say is that if people haven't gotten enough of you, and they clearly haven't, you just did a podcast or another interview for Middle East Eye, which of course you write for regularly, with the title there, How Israel Functions as an Extension of US Imperial Interests. And so that's over at the Middle East Eye YouTube channel, and there is a lot more for people to listen to. There, of course, is your column at Middle East Eye, where you provide a great deal of historical perspective on contemporary issues. Joseph, you are, of course, a professor of modern Arabic politics and intellectual history at Columbia University, and you are the author of numerous books, including Islam and Liberalism, Desiring Arabs, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question and Colonial Effects, as well as all your many, many interventions as one of, if I may say, our greatest public intellectuals, a real guide to helping us understand the times we're living in. We're so grateful for your time, and we really hope that you will come back soon to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thank you, Ali, and I would thank Electronic Intifada and the entire team for honoring me with this interview, and for the great work that you always do, and from which I benefit. And thank you for the generosity of this introduction. I look forward to our next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor.